Wellesley-Weston Lifetime Learning offers non-credit courses to seniors in the Greater Boston area. For more information about WWLL and links to our videos, please go to www.llcourses.org.
Good morning. We're going to get started now. I'm up here instead of Marion, who is not feeling too well. She sends her apologies and her greetings. And so it's my privilege to introduce our state representative, Alice Peisch. I hope you can hear me. Is this we've had so much trouble with microphones that I hope everyone... Can you hear me now? Now?
Yeah,
Is that
I think
better?
You have to hold it right.
All right. I'll try to keep it still. So, Marion prepared a very full introduction, and I'm going to read part of it to you now about Alice, who is the state representative for the 14th Norfolk District, which currently includes the towns of Wellesley-Weston and Precinct 4 of Wayland. Prior to her service in the legislature, Representative Peisch was active in Wellesley's municipal government, where she was a member of the town's Finance Advisory Committee and the School Committee, and was elected town clerk from 2000 to 2003. And those of us who live in Wellesley know that she's someone that we see around town and is really known for her accessibility, and we do thank you for that. She's so responsive to our needs and questions. So Representative Peisch was elected to the House of Representatives in 2003, is currently the House Chair of the Joint Committee on Education, a post she's held since 2011. In her role as chair, Representative Peisch works on matters relating to education from birth through grade 12. During her tenure, she has tackled a broad range of issues on topics such as special education, charter schools, school discipline, education collaboratives, curriculum, school finance, and virtual schools. In 2016, U.S. Secretary of Education John King appointed Representative Peisch to serve a 4-year term on the National Assessment Governing Board, which sets policy for the national assessment of educational progress in assessing student achievement. She also currently serves as the Democratic co-chair of the National Conference of State Legislatures, Standing Committee on Education. Representative Peisch serves as a member of the International Education Study Group and previously participated in NCSL's Early Learning Fellows Program. She's going to speak to us today partly about education, partly about the infrastructure of Massachusetts. She's going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll welcome questions and comments from the floor. So she hopes that you all are going to sit as close to the front as you can, move up so that we have a cohesive group here. And we'll be passing the microphone around so that everyone can hear the questions. Great pleasure to welcome you, Alice. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much. Now, I have a mic on. Can you hear me? Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for that very kind introduction. I would also like to thank the Wellesley-Weston Lifelong Learning Program for accommodating my schedule and unanticipated. I was scheduled initially to be here back in September, and I was unexpectedly hospitalized for about 10 days, so I was unable to make it, and so I appreciate your flexibility with respect to that. As Jill told you a little bit about my background, I thought I would just speak for a few minutes telling you what I see as the role, the job of a legislator, some of the work that we have been doing over the past session, there's a couple of questions relative to infrastructure and the national popular vote that were forwarded to me that I have a handout on. And then I will open it up to questions and answers. So to begin with, over the past 15 and a half years that I've been in the legislature, which seems hard for me to believe it's been that long, I've come to appreciate that the job really can be divided into three separate categories. The first is what is technically and legally what you'd find written both in the Constitution and in state policies about the job of a legislator, which is essentially to make and amend laws that govern statewide. That includes the annual budget. And that process is governed, again, by rules and regulations that the legislature itself enacts, as well as what the Constitution says we are responsible for. But the way the sort of bill law passing system in the legislature works is that we have 2-year sessions. We run for election every 2 years. The session begins in January. We have a bill filing deadline of the end of January, meaning any either amendment or new law that you want to see, you have to have drafted and filed with the clerk by the end of January. By sometime in March, all of the bills get distributed to the various committees. Everyone I will speak only about the House, since that is where I sit, although the Senate is very similar. Everyone is assigned to at least one committee. If you are a committee chair, you typically only have that one assignment. If you are not a chair, you typically sit on 3 or 4 other committees. We have every single bill that gets referred to a committee must have a public hearing. In addition to the public hearing, the committees all have staffs of analysts that do a lot of independent research on what's being proposed and meet with all the stakeholders and so on before we make a recommendation on the bills. The deadline for reporting every bill out of committee is currently the first week in February of the second year. So the first year, an awful lot of time is spent holding committee hearings and doing the research on the bills so that the committee has enough information to know whether to recommend favorably or not. Different committees have different amounts of work. So for example, the Education Committee has one of the larger jobs just by virtue of the number of bills that are filed. Typically, every session we have about somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 bills get filed. Only about 400 actually get all the way through to passage and enactment. And included in those 400 are home rule petitions, of which there are always quite a few. So the number of actual new laws that are passed each session is relatively small. My committee has about, this session has somewhere around 350 bills. The committee that has the most number of bills filed every session is the Judiciary Committee, which typically has somewhere between 700 and 800. And then you have some smaller committees that might only have 25 or 30. So there's quite a variation. So that's the legislative part of the job. And as the chair of a committee, that I spend a fair amount of time working fulfilling my responsibilities as the person who has to run the committee. The second part of the job is what I would call a municipal liaison. So there are a variety of areas where the municipal government and the state government might have overlapping responsibilities, or there are things that the state is responsible for that have a significant impact on municipalities. So a good example of that would be bridges and roads. So how many of you live in Wellesley? And the rest of you live in Weston, is that? No, where? Oh, so around here. Well, I'm going to give an example that's Wellesley-centric, but I think many of you may have experienced it. When I was first, about a year after I was first elected, construction started on replacing the Route 9, Route 16 bridge, which took forever. I believe it took 7 years. And I spent an incredible amount of time connecting the Department of Transportation, the State Department of Transportation, and the Wellesley DPW to try to resolve some of the issues that made that construction take so long. As a result of that, the state did acknowledge that that was an incredibly and unreasonably long time period, and they have enacted some policies to speed things up. They can't do it everywhere, but some of you may know that they replaced the Cedar Street Bridge over Route 9 in the space of a weekend. You can only do that if you've got a space to construct the bridge nearby. It's very complicated, but they also have really improved the process for just the regular construction with respect to how long it takes for certain bidding processes. And the biggest problem with the Route 9, Route 16 bridge was the coordination with the utilities, and they have developed a number of processes that they go through now before they start, so that they're not held up by that issue. So that's just one example of acting as a liaison between the community and the state. Another one that comes up with some frequency is with respect to communities that are in the process, and Wellesley is doing this right now, of either renovating, expanding, or building schools. In the first session that I was in the legislature, we created something called the School Building Authority, which oversees all school building projects that wish to have any kind of state reimbursement. And the reimbursement from the state runs anywhere from 30 to 80% of the total cost, depending on the financial resources that the community has. Needless to say, the communities that I represent are on the 30% end as opposed to the 80% end. But that, Wellesley High School, the field school in Weston, those were both projects where I spent a lot of time connecting the state building authority with the relevant individuals in the communities to make sure that, for the most part, there was some communication to the district about what the requirements were, but most of the work was in getting the school building authority to understand the needs of the communities and to make sure that a school was ultimately approved that was what the community would serve the needs of the communities. And then the third part of the job, so there's the legislative part, the liaison part, and then the third part is something that's referred to as constituent services. I'm sure you've probably all heard that term. And for the most part, that just means when there are individual residents of any of the communities that I represent who have some need for some service or other assistance from the state. Frequently, people don't know who to contact, or more commonly, they know who to contact. They have tried to contact that agency or individual, and they are getting no response, or not a satisfactory response, and they will then reach out to me, and most of the time we can get the issues resolved relatively quickly. The most common request, I think you will not be surprised to hear, has to do with people's interaction with the Registry of Motor Vehicles. There are, you can, as I'm sure many of you know, you can get a temporary handicap license plate if you have some temporary need for one, such as surgery or some illness that's not going to be of any long duration. And I have had some very frustrated constituents contact me when the period of their disability expired before they got any kind of response from the RMV. So if you ever are in need of that, call me first. It is something that generally we can turn around pretty quickly. I've also, there are people who have had difficulty getting, young people getting road tests and things of that nature. And then, of course, there are many other state agencies that individuals interact with, and I will get calls from time to time regarding maybe some Medicaid issues or unemployment or any number of other things. So those are the three main areas of responsibility. As I said earlier, I've chaired the Education Committee. I've been doing that now. I'm in my 8th year, and the committee's jurisdiction runs from essentially birth through grade 12, and it's divided largely into two areas. The early education, which is sort of any kind of child care / education before you get to the public school system, and then the K-12 system. And in my role on the Education Committee, I meet on a relatively frequent basis, usually once a month, with various representatives of the different stakeholder groups in education. So the Secretary of Education and the Commissioner of Education are very frequent meetings. I also have somewhat regular meetings with the School Superintendents Association, the School Committee Association, and the Teachers Associations. And we never, at least it's been my practice, to never report out a bill without getting the input of all of the affected parties. That does not mean that we will necessarily agree with everything that the different stakeholders would like to see happen. I think that the best standard that we try to apply is to recommend changes that will be in the best interests of the students. Sometimes that's not embraced by all of the other people who have to deliver whatever it is that we're requesting, but that seems to me to be what the focus of public education should be. But by the same token, I fully appreciate that if you don't have buy-in from the people that are being asked to do the work is probably not going to get done in any kind of a robust way. So there will be times, naturally, when some of the legislation may not be what I would view as ideal, but it is reflective of the input that we've had from the various constituencies that are impacted. I thought I would touch upon a few of the pieces of legislation that we have already enacted in this legislative session. And as we approach the end of the session, our sessions are divided into two types: formal sessions and informal sessions. Formal sessions are where there can be roll call votes. And you have to have a quorum, that is a majority of members present, in order to have a roll call vote. And we have roll call votes on two occasions, broadly speaking. One is when it's required by the Constitution, and that is generally, there are two areas where we are constitutionally required to have roll call votes. That is when we are voting on borrowing money, so any bond bills. And the second is when we are changing the designation of what is referred to as Article 97 or parkland or conservation land. And that usually is done pursuant to a home rule petition when a community wants to change the use of a land, and they have to get not only local approvals but also the approval of the state legislature. And then the second and more common roll call votes are on matters that are considered either very important and people want to be recorded so you know how they voted, or controversial, and oftentimes the important pieces are also controversial. We are in formal sessions, that is where roll call votes can be taken, from the first Wednesday in January of the first year of the session until the third Wednesday in November of that year, and then again from the first Wednesday in January until midnight July 31st of the second year. And the closer we get to the end, the more things come to the floor. So I mentioned earlier that we have a deadline of the first week in February to report bills out of committee. They can be there are three options: ought to pass, ought not to pass, and needs further study. The overwhelming majority of the bills go into the needs further study category because we simply do not have the capacity to analyze each and every bill that gets filed. Frequently, you will have what are called refiles, a bill that's been filed for a couple of sessions. If those bills have support, they are likely to move much more quickly because they have oftentimes had the benefit of at least some initial analysis in a prior session. So we are, as we're getting to the last 8 to 10 weeks of the session, things will start to move more quickly. They go from, sometimes a bill will go from directly from the first committee which is sort of subject matter jurisdiction, to what's called a Committee on Bills in the Third Reading, which basically looks at them to make sure that, you know, all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed and the right section of the general laws is referenced, and then it will come to the floor. But more often than not, bills will go to more than one committee. Most frequently, bills that come out of the subject matter committees go to the Ways and Means Committee for an analysis of what the potential cost might be before we take it up. So having said that, some of the bills that are of great significance, I think, that we have actually enacted this session already is a criminal justice reform bill, which was years in the making, which was an attempt to reduce the number of low-level crimes that have minimum mandatory sentences, as well as remove some of the obstacles that people face who have criminal records for, again, somewhat low-level crimes. So making it easier to have your records sealed. Raising the age of criminal responsibility from 7 to 12. That's different from being a juvenile. A couple of years ago, we raised the age from 17 to 18 for the distinction between being charged as a juvenile and charged as an adult. And that distinction has some ramifications with respect to your record and what kinds of punishments can be you can be subject to. So that's the criminal justice bill. Last fall, we passed a legislation that outlawed bump stocks. That was in response to that shooting in Las Vegas. This Wednesday, we will be taking up a bill that will expand the ability of the police to remove guns from people who are exhibiting dangerous behavior. It's often referred to as the red flag bill. We passed a law that gives pregnant workers, was referred to as a Bill of Rights for pregnant workers, simple things like allowing pregnant women to use the bathroom during the course of their 8-hour working shift. And then we also passed a bill in response to a change at the federal level with respect to insurance coverage for contraception. The federal government changed the requirement that contraception be available under health insurance with no copay. They reversed that, so we passed a law that in Massachusetts, insurance companies must provide contraceptive coverage with no copay. I think that, and then we're in the middle right now of doing the budget. The House we passed a budget for FY19 at the end of April, and the Senate is debating it this week. I expect they'll finish it by the end of the week. It will then go to a conference committee, and the governor will hopefully be on his desk by the end of June. There was a period of time many years ago where the state budget used to routinely go way beyond the July 1st start of the new fiscal year. That is something that we have changed our practice, and I think the latest that the budget has ever gotten to the governor in the 15 years that I've been in the House was maybe like the first week in July. So that has been, I think, a positive development with respect to how the legislature works and being responsive to the needs of the residents of the community. I have here a handout, which I'll just distribute now. I was contacted by someone from this organization on Friday who was interested in information on the national popular vote. This is something, this has to do with the Electoral College, and it's something that we enacted a few years ago, and it gives you some information on it. It basically says that once enough states pass this law so that their electoral votes would determine the outcome of an election, their electors must vote consistently with the majority of voters across the country as opposed to just their state. It is a way to ensure that the will of the popular vote is followed. There are nowhere near enough states yet who have signed on to this. I don't know whether it will ever get a critical mass to allow it to be utilized. And then on the back is some information about transportation. Someone was asking about infrastructure. In addition to what is on this handout, we also recently passed a $200 million municipal bridge and road bond bill, which provides funding for municipalities to, the bridges and roads in municipalities to be either repaired or replaced. So that covers all of the topics that I wanted to say a few words on, and now I would love to answer any questions you may have about anything that I have already addressed or anything else having to do with state government. Yes?
My burning question is, I have thoughts about all sorts of issues that come up at the state, and I don't know what's a best way to, easy way for me to be trying to let my rep know what's important to me.
I think the best way is directly, and I would utilize email. We all have a State House email. I mean, everyone I know monitors it very closely, and it's one of the, I mean, I look at it over the weekend in the evening just to make sure that I haven't missed anything, as well as having some of the people in my office monitoring it. So, and Paul is very responsive. So I think if you sent him an email about anything, you can be sure that he would not only read it, but take some action on it.
Sometimes we sit down in his theater lobby and talk.
Yes.
That he owns.
Yes, I know.
So since I have the mic,
yes.
It's wonderful to me that you have a list on the of all the many bills that you've been involved for. How do I look up more information about what you've listed there?
So that's a very good question. There is a legislative website. If you just Google Massachusetts legislature, the website will come up. And it does have it has a lot of information. I think one of the big challenges with any website is figuring out where is the information that you particularly, I think we have an overload of information these days. But if you go to the website, and then you can look up a number of different things. One would be you can look up individual legislators, and under their page are all the bills that they filed. So it gives you some information about what bills have been filed. And then you can click on the bill, and it'll give you the bill history so you can see what happened to it. Is it moving? Did it get sent to study? Did it get changed by the committee? And all of the drafts are up there. I will say, you know, reading legislation is a good thing if you are having trouble falling asleep, because it is not very clear. It's mainly, you know, striking the fifth sentence in paragraph X of General Laws Chapter Y and replacing it with a phrase. And so it's hard sometimes to read the legislation and fully understand exactly what it's trying to do. Most of us have some outreach where we try to let the people we represent know what's happening. So, for example, twice a year, I do a newsletter that I send out electronically to people who are interested in it, and then provide hard copies at the local libraries and town halls. And I think most of my colleagues do something similar. But if you have anything specific, I would be happy to send you more info. When we finish up, if you want to tell me what you're specifically interested in, I'd be happy to send you more information.
Thank you for coming today.
Oh, you're welcome. Anyone else?
I'm a resident of Phillips Park, and quite a few residents there live in the apartments and also in Seaward. Now, our problem is that, I'm sorry to bother you, but this is a minor problem. Coming down Seaward and making a left turn, we've asked the town to do something about it. They say, no, it's a state problem because it's a state highway. We'd like to change the traffic pattern or the lights so that you can make a left turn, because I don't know if you have driven
So a
them.
left turn onto Washington Street?
What?
So you want to take a left turn from Seaward onto
Coming down
Washington Street?
Seaward, and you will make a left turn on Washington Street.
Yes. I will talk to the town hall, to the selectman's office about that. The selectmen have jurisdiction over the streets. Route 16 is a state road,
Yeah, state highway.
but there is a process by which the town can request approval to do things of that nature. So let me look into it and see what the status is of that.
Because they just say, we can't do anything. It's
So
a
when you
state
get
highway.
when you have the green light, it's not possible to make the left turn?
It's very confusing. People, fortunately, there haven't been many accidents, but it's very difficult.
Yeah. Well, I would be happy to check with the selectmen and find out if they have done anything with respect to requesting approval for that. It may be that the selectmen have done their own analysis and feel that what they currently have is the best situation. But the best way to get people who are elected to represent you to change their minds is to have more than one person contact them requesting something of that nature.
Okay.
But I'd be happy to get back to you about that.
Okay, thank you very much.
The Green Line extension on the MBTA, what does that extend to? And does it use existing track for that purpose?
It is a huge project. It extends the Green Line into Somerville. I don't know the specifics of exactly where in Somerville because that's not my district, but it is being done as, believe it or not, it is something that was required as mitigation for the expansion for the Big Dig. So when we expanded built the Ted Williams Tunnel and put 93 underground, there was some expansion there of the highways. And in order to get all the approvals for that, the state was required to commit to extending public transportation in some way. And extending the Green Line to Somerville was what was ultimately negotiated. It's taken years of planning and negotiating with the federal government to get funding, but it has begun. And there was an original plan that was developed when Governor Patrick was in office that was viewed as too expensive. So they went back and modified it somewhat, but it is not current track. So it's having to build out the track as well as getting new equipment and so on.
This school killing in Texas has everyone disturbed, and it seems to me a reasonable approach might be to require all gun owners to keep their weapons locked up securely with limited access to the keys. Would there be any movement here in this state to forward such a proposal?
So I believe that is already a requirement in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has some of, if not the strongest, some of the strongest gun control legislation in the country. After the Sandy Hook incident, we reviewed our gun laws to make sure that there wasn't anything more we could do, and we added a number of things back in 2014, I believe. And then as other situations have developed, we have, as I mentioned, we were the first state to ban bump stocks right after the Las Vegas situation. And we are now this week going to pass this bill that will allow guns to be taken away from people who exhibit some signs of instability or danger to others. The biggest challenge we have is the lack of action at the federal level. Massachusetts, it used to be that automatic rifles were banned across the country. And in 2004, that was repealed. Massachusetts continues to ban assault rifles. But since you can get them in other places, they find their way here. We have the lowest rate of death by guns in the country. So I think that shows that reasonable, strong laws do have an impact on, you know, we're not perfect. We have plenty of people that are killed by guns. But I think increasingly, the lack of action from Congress is, from my perspective, unacceptable. But I don't, you know, there's very little we in Massachusetts can do because all of our federal delegation are very supportive of these measures. It's not enough people across the country that are. I don't know whether you saw this or not, but the former Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, has come out in support of a movement for families to essentially boycott school until Congress acts. That obviously is not going to work unless you have a huge number of people doing it, and I'm a little skeptical that we'll have millions of parents keeping their kids home from school. But I think one of the things that's really, really disturbing is, you probably saw the quote from one of the students at that high school when asked if she was surprised or shocked. She said, no, I expected sooner or later this would happen, given what's happening. My daughter is a high school teacher, and she tells me every day she goes to school, she and every other teacher wonder which one of their kids might be the one that brings the gun. So it's a terrible situation.
It seems to me that mental health is an important part of the gun issue. And I just wonder what regulations and where Massachusetts is in that regard.
So I think we are ahead of the curve, but probably could do better. We have a mental health parity law, meaning that health insurance has to cover mental health as well as physical health. I think if you talk to people who are seeking services, they feel that despite that mental health services are often difficult to access. We are putting more and more funding into mental health services in schools. I hear all the time from superintendents and principals about the increased number of students that come to school with mental health problems. This bill that I mentioned earlier that we're going to take up on Wednesday part of it is designed to help identify people who have mental health issues and get the weapons away from them. But definitely more that can be done on just in general. I think, you know, the lack of mental health services impacts many, many areas, not just, most people who have mental health issues are not violent, but they still are, lack of treatment results in, you know, a lot of this opioid abuse as well as other problems that interfere with being able to lead productive lives. So it's something I'm supportive of, but at some point, the state only has so much revenue, and without more, it's going to be tough to expand that kind of program to the full extent that it's probably needed.
My question was very much like his. And when you mentioned that it was passed, that people with mental problems and needs, that was added to the bill, I wanted to know what the definition of that was and how you were going to seek those people out.
So it's not specific. First of all, we're taking it up on Wednesday, so the final language is never determined until the bill is enacted. But it establishes a process by which someone can ask the police, can go to the police and ask them, and alert them to the fact that they think someone is dangerous. It wouldn't necessarily be someone who has a mental illness, but it could be. And then within a certain relatively limited period of time, the individual has the right to go to court to challenge the action. And then the judge would have to decide whether there really was a reasonable basis for believing the person was dangerous, because you do want to guard against not only an unfair treatment of someone who might have a mental illness but is not violent, and against people making unsubstantiated allegations because they maybe have an issue with the individual that has nothing to do with that. So there'll be a lot of protections and due process put in place so that no one is not treated fairly.
I also wondered what is your interaction with the governor, you and other state representatives, and how does that work when these bills come up?
So generally speaking, the interaction with the governor's office is usually through the people in the agencies that are impacted by the legislation. So for example, on education bills, I will get the input of both the Commissioner of Education as well as the Secretary, and the Secretary is the one who's really representing the governor's point of view. But there have been times when I have met one-on-one with the governor on bills so that he understands where I'm coming from, I understand where he's coming from. I would say that Governor Baker has been has developed a very good relationship with the legislature. He is very willing to engage in discussion and try to work towards reaching some consensus on the issues. Not 100%, but I have found him to be very open, and the same goes for the people that work for him that I have had to deal with.
I had two questions. One was, I read in the newspaper today that Baker is thinking about reinstating the death penalty. And could you share with us what the procedure and how you all would be involved in that decision? And then the other question I wanted to ask you is if you would go over some of the low-level crimes that the criminal justice bill covered.
So in response to the first question about the death penalty, that would have to be through a change to state law. The death penalty is currently not available in Massachusetts. In the 15 years that I've been in the legislature, it has come up for vote a couple of times. The last time would have been when Governor Romney was governor. It has been overwhelmingly defeated. To my knowledge, the governor has not filed a bill to do that, and I don't think that it would have any chance of making it through the legislature. And we'll see if he actually does that. With respect to the low-level crimes, they're predominantly drug offenses, possession of relatively small amounts. It's all relative, and some of the sales that are relatively modest, so could be viewed as just supporting the habit of the person who's selling, as opposed to a drug trafficker who makes a business out of selling. So that's the overwhelming majority of them. And those are the ones that have had the minimum mandatories. The minimum mandatories, by and large, grew out of the so-called war on drugs, and that has not proven to be terribly effective.
There seems to be a movement towards recreational use of marijuana.
More than a movement.
Okay. And one of the big issues in my mind is somebody operating under the influence, and how is that determined and quantified and recorded and all those kind of things?
So that's a very good question. As you probably know, marijuana, recreational marijuana, became legal in the Commonwealth via a ballot question. The question did not pass in Wellesley, but it passed across the state. So we spent a fair amount of time last year modifying the question as it was passed by the voters, largely because it was essentially written by the industry and therefore had a lot of language that was very favorable to the marijuana industry. So we've created this Cannabis Control Commission to oversee the implementation of the law. It, I believe, contains a provision directed at ascertaining, coming up with some mechanism by which we can ensure that, or determine whether someone is operating under the influence. It is not legal to operate under the influence of any drug. So I think, you know, this is one of those things that July 1st is when it actually starts to become available. I think we'll be closely monitoring the implementation and the impact to see if there's anything else that we need to do to make sure that we keep the public safe. I think until it actually starts, it's going to be hard to know whether what we have put in place is sufficient or not.
So there are some quantitative ways to determine when somebody's...
I don't think that there are yet. I think the law has directed the commission to look into that and try to figure out what can be done. There's no equivalent of a breathalyzer as far as I know.
So in other words, we're going to go through with allowing this and then think about what the test will be after there's been a problem? Is that what we're talking about?
No.
No.
My understanding, and I could get you more specific detail on it, is that the commission, one of the responsibilities of the commission is to determine how to, what mechanism should be used to be able to see if someone is operating. And I just simply don't know the answer to that. I'm happy to get you more information on it. I know this was a big issue that the committee, there was a special committee put together. I was not on that committee. The bill's probably this thick, so I don't have it committed to memory. But it is one of the issues that piece of legislation that we passed about a year ago in response to the ballot question passing.
So again, I'm still confused. Are they going to be able to sell recreational marijuana without these laws in place?
Well, the laws are in place. It is illegal to operate a motor vehicle under the influence.
No, there's no method of testing that, so they're not in place. There's no method.
Well, if you, I don't want to get...
Short of a blood test.
I will get you more information. I know that this was something that we dealt with. That the law deals with. I cannot recall specifically whether or not there was a specific measure. I don't think so. I think the measure is being developed. But this is what happens when you have ballot questions. A question goes on the ballot. You can't go in and vote yes if or yes but. It's yes or no. And we frequently more and more frequently have questions that come to the ballot that we then have to implement.
Well, again, then it's someone's job to let the public know exactly what that question is.
Well,
and
I
knew at least that there is no way to detect it at this time, and it's not ready to go.
I don't disagree with you. And we have done all we can to try to put something in place, and I will take your contact information down and give you a more specific answer to exactly what is happening relative to that particular question.
Thank you.
This morning's Globe had an interesting article about possible sending of seniors, in-prison seniors with serious medical problems, removing them from prison and sending them free. I think this is a very good idea. My only question is, what happens to these people after they're in the streets? So it's a two-edged sword.
Yes, it is. And I think that is something that will have to be studied and some plan developed. You cannot just open the gates to the prison and think that the people are going to, these are people who've been there for decades. I would assume that there was something in the article that suggested that it would be much less costly. Presumably that is because the people would be living at home and or in some sort of assisted living facility that's not as expensive to operate as a prison. But there'll still be a significant cost associated with taking care of people who are ill.
It seems to me it's a device for reducing prison costs, but not overall costs.
That is what I would think too, and it doesn't, in the great scheme of things, lower costs to the Commonwealth. If it's possible that there could be health care provided in a different setting that might not be quite as expensive, but I don't know. That's something that I imagine there'll be a lot of time spent analyzing that before any change is made.
Currently in Massachusetts, teachers pay into a pension fund and are not able to get Social Security, or if they are, it's after a certain number of years they can get it, but it's greatly reduced, the windfall elimination. Is there any legislation to change that? I know that's been brought up several times.
I believe that's a federal issue. That's not something that the state can change. It has to go through Congress, and there are a number of states that are in the same situation. I'm not sure if everyone here understood the question. Anyone in Massachusetts who gets a state or municipal pension, which they pay into instead of paying into Social Security, if they are also eligible for Social Security because, as is often the case with teachers, they may work in the summer or have some other job, or maybe went into teaching after they did something in the private sector, you can be eligible for Social Security, but what you can actually collect is greatly reduced by your state pension. So you could get a letter from Social Security like we all get saying, if you retire at X age, you will get Y. If you are receiving any kind of state or municipal pension, that number is greatly reduced. I would not hold out a whole lot of hope for that changing because the number of states where that is the case is very small. So there are not enough legislators in Congress for whom that is an issue in their state. There's not a majority. And it will cost the federal government more money if they have to pay out what people, under the Social Security laws are in fact entitled to, but because of this provision that was, I think, enacted in the 1950s, those benefits are not available. I wish I could be more encouraging. I know Barney Frank used to file it all the time, and he's the one who told me he didn't have much hope because there weren't enough states where it was an issue. Any other questions, comments? Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming and your patience in listening to me this morning. And again, if you ever have any questions about anything, do not hesitate to contact me. Email is the best way, and you can, if you Google my name, the State House website will come up, which has the contact information on it, which is the easiest, although I will tell you what it is, just in case you want to write it down. It is alice.peisch@mahouse.gov. So a little long, longer than Gmail, but not terribly difficult to remember. So thank you all once again.